Nobody woke up one day and said, golly, the ancient world's ended, it's now the Middle Ages. Nobody woke up and said, finally, the Middle Ages are over, today we've got the Renaissance. So it's important to remember that there's a certain kind of way in which we can't give purely objective criteria for saying we've moved from this era to that era. In fact, there are scholars today who want to reorganize the history of this time and say that we really ought to talk about the ancient world, then we ought to talk about late antiquity as a period that was going to begin with Constantine, and then we want to talk about the Middle Ages beginning perhaps the time of Charlemagne, suggesting that this period we're looking at today, which is traditionally called the early or the beginning of the Middle Ages, really is not properly placed because it sounds like there's a radical division between ancient and medieval. But rather, we ought to recognize a transitional period that in a sense is not quite like classical antiquity, but also not quite like the way we tend to define the basic characteristics of the Middle Ages. So that's one point we ought to have as background before we begin. Second point is that if you learned somewhere along the way, grade school, high school, or college, that in the ancient world there were a lot of important cities, and at the beginning of the Middle Ages, those cities didn't quite disappear, but really became much less important, much more peripheral to what was going on in the society. In a sense, in a broad sense, that's correct. And it's important to remember that Christianity was, from the beginning, a Roman religion, that is to say, a religion that met and existed inside the Roman Empire. But it was also an urban religion. Paul traveled to cities, for example. Bishops were the leaders of city communities, and that the conversion of people in the country, sometimes centuries behind, happens in cities. So what happens to Christianity when there's no longer the structure of the Roman Empire in which Christianity began? And what happens as the importance of cities and their size fade and the dominant institutions of the early Middle Ages are essentially located in the countryside? Obviously, Christianity has to change because the world in which Christianity exists changes a great deal. Let's see if we can put now some details, some flesh on that skeleton I just outlined for you. We know that already in the 4th century, with the Goths in particular, Germanic tribes began to move into the Roman Empire, and that movement became much bigger at the beginning of the 5th century. And although some Germanic tribes moved into the eastern part of the empire, it was primarily the Latin-speaking part of the Roman Empire that faced these groups of Germanic warriors and their chiefs. And let me suggest that we have some symbolic markers here. The year 410, which I mentioned with regard to St. Augustine, the city of Rome was sacked by Goths. In 455, it was sacked by a charming Germanic tribe called the Vandals, obviously from which we get our word vandalism. And by 476, there was no emperor in Italy. There was no emperor in the West anymore. There was an emperor in Constantinople, and he claimed that he was still the emperor of all of Rome, but there was no emperor in the West. And very often, in textbooks and whatever, 476 is the date of the fall of the Roman Empire. It isn't quite that clear that everything changed with the last Roman emperor not being replaced, because the last few Roman emperors were largely puppets anyway. And secondly, it's important to remember that the Roman Empire continued for another 1,000 years in Constantinople. We call that the Byzantine Empire, but they called themselves the Roman Empire, and it is worth remembering that. Now, it is true that in the 6th century, an emperor named Justinian, the last Latin-speaking emperor in Constantinople, by the way, Justinian had as his goal to bring all the Roman Empire back together. Take it away from those various Germanic tribes that had taken over parts of the Latin Empire and put it all back together. And by golly, he did a pretty good job, at least of starting that process. He got North Africa back from the tribe called the Vandals, and not once but twice, in fact, he conquered Italy. And so it looked like he was on the way to reestablishing the Roman Empire. But for a lot of reasons, including lack of money, Persia on the eastern coast, and the Teutonic Plague, he was never able to finish the job. And in fact, those conquests remained impermanent. In other words, after a while, the empire in Constantinople no longer governed those territories in North Africa and Italy. Let's get some names with regard to these Germanic tribes, because we're going to spend a while for several lectures looking at how these Germanic tribes become linked up not just to Christianity, but in particular to Roman Christianity. That is to say, pledging their loyalty to the Bishop of Rome, to the Pope. We can divide the Germanic tribes into two groups. One group came in as Christians, but if you will, the wrong kind of Christians. That is to say, as Arians, rather than as those who accepted the decrees of the Council of Nicaea. And among the Arian Christian tribes were the Ostrogoths and Visigoths. Ostrogoths ended up in Italy, Visigoths in Spain. Burgundians, they ended up in part of what is now France, obviously called Burgundy. The Vandals, who took North Africa, and the Lombards, who later on came in to rule Italy in the 6th century. So they all came in, from the point of view of the Bishop of Rome and the bishops in general, they all came in as heretics. So they are military problems and they are religious problems. Then there's a set of Germanic tribes that came in as pagans. In particular, the Franks, who come into what's now France, the Angles, who obviously go to England, Angle land, after all, is England, and the Saxons, some of whom went to England and some of whom stayed in what's now the area of Germany we call Saxony. So they are pagans, and therefore they cause a different problem than the Arians. They're a different kind of religious problem. They need to be converted to Christianity, not persuaded to take up the right form of Christianity. So we need to be aware of the fact that in so many ways, the disintegration of the Roman Empire in the West and the arrival of these Germanic tribes is an extraordinary challenge to the institutions of the church, to the functioning of all of Roman society. Here's a good question. If you've got Germanic tribesmen coming in and more or less taking control of the Western Roman Empire, they couldn't replace what the Roman Empire did. Think, for example, about the great tradition of Roman civil law. The Romans had a written law code and commentaries and people who studied law and all the rest. Germanic tribesmen came in without a written language. And their law was a kind of customary law that was radically different from the law of the Roman Empire. Now, these Germans were always a small minority. They came as a conquering minority. They didn't move to get rid of the people who already lived there. They came in and ruled over those people. So the Roman civil administration disappears. Imagine yourself, you're a little farmer, and some great big farmer comes and picks on you, tries to take away your land unfairly. In the old days, what would you do? You would go to the Roman civil authorities and say, this person's violating the law, I want you to set it right. And there would be a way under Roman law for that to occur. Now, what do you do if you're that same small farmer? That these are very serious problems, because who's going to make sure the walls of a city are under-repaired so the city isn't attacked? Who's going to make sure that there is water and food in cities? That was the job of the Roman government. That's what Roman emperors and Roman governors and Roman city councils and so on did. And now those people are displaced. And you've got very different kinds of people who are calling the shots and who are militarily superior. Well, let me suggest that frequently in the cities of the West, the answer to where do you go for help is the local bishop. Now, before we take up the role of bishop as we transition from the ancient world to the medieval world, if I can go back to those old terms, let's say something about this office of bishop. I've mentioned that as early as Paul's letters, or at least those letters attributed to Paul that probably came a generation later, we have the mention of a bishop or overseer in Christian communities. I pointed out that around 100, St. Ignatius of Antioch not only is a bishop, but he talks about that as being the proper structure of a Christian community. And although not all Christian communities develop this idea of a single head, a kind of chief priest, if you will, in each community, that did gradually develop. But here's a good question. What was the authority of a bishop? What was the principle behind the idea of having a kind of single head in each Christian community? This goes back really to the time when the apostles die off. What happens to the authority that the apostles had? Did it die with them because Jesus appointed individuals to do things and now those individuals are dead? There is no one who could take their place? Or, as came to be the more common belief, is it that Jesus essentially established an office when he commissioned the apostles to do certain things? And if that is so, then the people who hold that office after that, the people who do what apostles had done a generation earlier, they inherit that authority. So that it's as if every generation is its own apostle. Bishops are successors of the apostles. Therefore, they have authority that Christ gave the apostles. We call this the theory of apostolic succession. And today, among Christians, Catholics, Orthodox, Anglicans believe in apostolic succession. Other forms of Protestantism don't. They have different kinds of governance structures, one from another. So the bishop is essentially the apostle alive today in that office, not necessarily having the same good character as the apostles, but nevertheless having the same authority. So the bishops are the sort of obvious people to go to when you've got a problem. They are the leaders in their communities, in a sense, by default, because there really isn't any civil authority. So we can imagine what happens. There is a famine. There is a food shortage. Who do you go to? Who takes charge? Who tries to deal with starvation taking place in a city? Very often it's bishop. We have stories from 6th century Gaul, that is to say from what's now France, about bishops doing that kind of provisioning, taking care of the sick, providing whatever physical needs are required in a particular community. And so we have the apostles, that is to say their successors, the bishops, taking over a lot of functions that at one time belonged to civil authorities. And if that is true of bishops in general, it is especially true of the Bishop of Rome, that is to say, of the Pope. After all, Rome was the seat of the empire, and now there's no emperor there. Who takes charge of Rome? We have some stories about Pope Gregory the Great, who is, by the way, the fourth of those Latin doctors that I mentioned. He dies in 604. And Gregory dealt with plague in Rome, trying to provide relief. Gregory also made sure that there was food in Rome and that the walls were strong because the Lombards, who were German Aryans, were threatening to attack the city. So Gregory did things that a century beforehand, a century and a half beforehand, would have been done by the civil authorities. But there's really nobody else to do these things except for the Bishop of Rome. Let me also suggest that for many people, it was not just a matter of, I've got a problem, I'll go to the bishop of my local community, but also there are other ways in which other important Christians got in on this problem of providing things that at one time were taken care of by the civil authorities. So, for example, if I'm being treated unfairly, I might go to my bishop. I also might go to a monk, a hermit, or a monk living in a monastery because, hey, here's the way it works. Monks talk to God all the time. That's what monks do. They communicate with God. So I would like to have on my side to convince the monk that I'm in the right, that I'm just, and I would like that monk talking to God on my behalf. That may even be better than having the emperor on my side, like would have happened in the old days. So very often, even people who left the world, monks and hermits, found themselves involved in the world because the world needed their help, a kind of help that they didn't set out to be monks in order to give, but a kind of help that was necessary because of the lack of these civic authorities to do these things. So we need to realize how much ordinary people, who of course are now by and large Christian, how much ordinary people depended on either a church official or a person thought of as a holy person. And those people did, or tried to do, a lot of the things that had been done by the Roman government when there was a Roman Empire. And let's also take a quick review here of a couple things. And remember that in Rome itself, we have a kind of positive relationship between emperor and pope from the very beginning of the time of the official Christianization of Rome. That is to say, the time of Constantine. Remember that Constantine gave to the pope the Lateran Palace, for example. I want to also remind you what Dante said. I quoted this at the beginning of an earlier lecture, that this was the beginning of the church's downfall, because the church began to be a property owner. And as I've already said, it soon begins to do various kinds of things that could be called secular things. And as a result, we begin to get, we might say, this sort of mixing up of sacred and secular things. They were pretty clear at a time when the church was poor and tiny and zealous and persecuted. But now the church is becoming rich. It's becoming a bigger mixture of different kinds of people with different levels of commitment. And therefore, as the church changes and gets property and gets certain kinds of authority, at least de facto authority, it's going to make a lot of changes. Again, let me remind you that one of the symbols of those changes, a symbol you can see today if you go to Rome, are these huge churches that were built in the 4th and 5th century, beautifully decorated with mosaics and marble floors, gorgeous buildings. People still marvel at them. And by the way, I want to make a plug. Very often when people go to Rome as visitors, they go see the great monuments of ancient Rome, a wonderful thing to do. They go see the monuments of Renaissance and Baroque Rome, in particular the Vatican, a wonderful thing to do. And they very often don't visit some of the churches built from the 4th and 5th century on through the Middle Ages, which tend to be decorated with spectacular mosaics and are important monuments that simply, if they were in a city without all that ancient and Baroque stuff, people would travel to see. But because they have to compete for attention with St. Peter's or with the Roman Forum and the Colosseum, they just don't get looked at a lot. So if you are in Rome anytime soon, get out a good guidebook and find some of those churches. I mentioned Santa Pudenziana as having the oldest major mosaic in Rome, dating from around 390, and there are many, many others as well. Now, let me suggest something else that happens, especially with the collapse of Roman authority in the West, in terms of the church becoming wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. Why would you give money or land or goods to the church? Well, let's start with the most benign of reasons. I'm thankful to God. And I have the means to build a big building or to commission a statue or a painting or a mosaic of Jesus, and I do that out of piety. I do that out of thanks. Or I can give the church some land. And from that land, they can produce a certain amount of food, agriculture. They can sell that food, and they can use that money in doing the things the church does. might be helping the poor, might be building a building. But there are a lot of good reasons for people who have the means to give these gifts, very often expensive gifts and extensive gifts, to the church. Let me suggest also that there are some who don't have perhaps quite as pure a motive. We know, and we find this happening in a long period of Christian history, not just at this time, there are people who essentially want to bargain with God. Sort of goes this way. It'd be in more pious terms than this, but it sort of goes this way. Hey, God, I'm doing this and this and this and this for you. I'm buying you a mosaic. I'm giving a farm to a monastery. I'm doing all these things. Okay, God, you sort of owe me. Now, obviously, people aren't that crass about it, by and large. But we can see how that mentality works. I want to just sort of overwhelm God with gifts. By the way, that's the way pagan religions basically worked. I mean, if you look at a lot of pagan religions, whether it's worshiping Zeus or whoever it might be, a lot of that is simply paying off the gods. These gods have all this power. I want them to use that power on my behalf and not against me. What am I going to do? I'm going to shower them with gifts. Whether that gift is money or a sacrificial animal or simply singing songs of praise, that's what I'm going to do. But I'm looking for a return on that. And it's not hard to imagine. These are not crass, calculating people. But it's easy to imagine how that mentality becomes a part of why I might think about giving a gift to God. It's probably, by the way, not completely absent among some generous givers to the church, even today. Now, what else can you give other than land or a building? Well, how about a gold chalice? How about something beautiful made out of silver, a cross maybe? So the church begins to acquire land, buildings, but also beautiful, precious, expensive things. Hey, I got something better than a silver cross for you. How about a silver cross with gems in it? Bet God would like that. So the church begins to get, if you will, a lot of stuff. And again, that can be gold, that can be property, buildings, land. And I want to emphasize that as we go through the Middle Ages for several centuries, there's going to be sort of a movement away from a money economy to a barter economy, away from money. And when you don't have a money economy, guess what's the number one thing of value? Land. And the church accumulates land, lots of it. People estimate that by the high Middle Ages, say the 12th, 13th century, some church institution, whether it's a monastery or bishop or whatever, perhaps owned a third of all the land in Europe. Now, that's a very broad estimate. It might be off by quite a bit. But even if that's a reasonable estimate, even if that's a ballpark figure, it reminds us of how wealthy the church became. Now, where do we go from here? If the church is wealthy, if monasteries are gaining wealth, if the bishops are gaining the control of wealth, again, to be used in the monastery for pious things, to be used by the bishop to fix those walls, to provision the city with food, to help the poor. But the church is gathering all this property. And if land is the measurement of wealth and the church has a lot of land, then guess what happens next? Kings, Germanic chieftains who become kings, become very interested in who the bishop is. Because if the bishop's a big player, if the bishop owns a lot of land and therefore has wealth and power, the king would like that bishop to be on his side. And so we find very often what kings want to do is influence who becomes bishop or even who becomes the abbot of a monastery. Now, imagine how this is going to happen. We can certainly imagine a king saying to those who are selecting a bishop, let me tell you my candidate. Let me tell you the guy that I would like to be chosen. It may be some pious man, but it isn't piety that got this guy the king's backing. He might be loyal, he might be a relative. He might be a good administrator. And you want somebody who's a good administrator of land. You want the people who have the power and the wealth to use it well and to be loyal to you. And so we have the beginning of real influence peddling, that's perhaps too strong a term, with regard to the Germanic leaders as to who becomes the abbot or the bishop. And again, what I want to emphasize is that a bishop, for example, let's just use that, a bishop is a shepherd. He's a pastor. He is a shepherd of his flock. He is to care for them. In fact, Pope Gregory the Great wrote a famous book called Pastoral Care. Of course, that contains the word pastor, shepherd. So if we think about what are the criteria for a good shepherd, what do you want in a good shepherd? Probably that's a fairly different list for what are the criteria the king is looking for in a good and loyal bishop. It's not that this system becomes terribly corrupt right away. It's not that kings just move in and start saying, you'll be a bishop, you'll be an abbot. But what I'm suggesting is that as the church gets wealthier, then the secular authorities have more interest in who's heading up the various pieces of the church, be it a monastery or be it a bishop. And this is going to have consequences for the future. Let me suggest that, therefore, what we're looking at is the beginning of sort of a, how do we want to say this, a sort of blurring of the line between what we would call sacred and secular. We might even say church and state, although it's hard to call some of these Germanic chieftains heads of state in any meaningful way. But things that were fairly obviously separated in early Christian times, when Christianity operated essentially often de facto in opposition to the political power, the Roman Empire. Now, this friendliness, you've got kings who are Christian, the Germanic tribesmen who are pagan become Catholics, and ultimately the Arians become Catholics too, although that takes a while. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. What we have is, in a sense, everybody is, at least on paper, on the same page religiously. Kings defend monasteries. They don't always, but they do in theory. And monasteries pray for kings because everybody's a Christian. That's the direction we're moving. And it's obvious to see the advantages of that in terms of privileging the church, having great buildings, having a certain kind of authority, not having to hide, being able to reach out to everybody. Those are all the advantages of this. But we need to see that there are also some disadvantages. And furthermore, I want to go back to a point I made earlier, and that is that at the same time these bishops are becoming wealthy, both bishops and monks are also being put in the position of taking authority, fixing walls, provisioning cities, trying to help people who are being treated unfairly by the powerful, and so on. So you've got a combination of the increase in certain kinds of authority that by and large the church didn't ask for, and increase in the wealth and power of the church. And this combination is going to cause grave problems, because I think it's fair to say it is relatively easy to justify the church having that wealth, using it for good things. It's very easy to understand why church officials took on certain roles of authority over material things, because there wasn't anybody else to do it. But here's the problem. Once the church has that power, and once the church has that wealth, it's very easy to treat it as something they've got to have. It was easy, and perhaps in some ways even unconscious, to accumulate that authority and that wealth. At some point, when the church is going to be called to give it up, or at least to modify the way they use it and the way they manipulate it, it's going to be a lot harder to do that. And getting this all sort of settled out between sacred and secular. How do we deal with the wealth and the power of the church? This is in many ways a central drama for really the next almost 1,000 years that we call the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And we're going to be spending a lot of time examining those periods and looking at those periods through that particular historical lens.